Right, thank you very much indeed. I hope you can hear me now at the back. Yeah, good. Thank you very much. I feel very honoured to give a lecture that's named in honour of Gillian Birrell, and I'm grateful to Richard for having invited me. And in an attempt to minimise my carbon footprint with my new no-fly policy, I'd like to apologise to Richard for 2 cancelled trains, 1 that ran late until I finally got in here at 1 minute to 4, so I probably raised his blood pressure. I will continue my no-fly policy, despite the fact that it's 3 times as expensive and twice as long, but I believe it's worth it. As I say, I feel very honoured to be here. I think Edinburgh's been a real engine room of intellectual heavy weightlifting when it comes to some of the ideas that I'm talking about. It's great to see Peggy in the front row, and I know Andy Clark's done a lot here, and there are many people who will be very familiar with the notion of predictive processing. And what I want to talk about is how this sort of framework can help people like me who began life, as Richard said, as a clinician, and I still am a part-time clinician. I'm a psychiatrist interested in psychosis, and I want to really use this as an opportunity to explore the possibilities of applying what may be seen as an esoteric or arcane framework in the context of a clinical problem that has troubled me since I was a medical student. So the overview, there's really an overview of what I'd like to say and what I'd like to convey. And what I'd like to say is essentially cover the nature of psychosis very, very briefly, what it is and why I find it especially difficult to understand. And think about how we can begin to understand the mechanisms by which symptoms of psychosis arrive, because I see this as an important starting point to any sincere and successful and credible therapeutic set of interventions, whether those are pharmacological, cognitive, psychological, or social. So I want to do that by considering actually the computational challenges that we think that the brain faces day to day, and think of the brain as a predictive inference device, and perception is what Ramesh Jain referred to as a controlled hallucination. I don't fully buy into that idea, but I think it's a useful heuristic for thinking about the normal process of perception, which is very closely linked to the nature of psychosis. And I want to present some data that suggests that this framework can generate some interesting testable hypotheses, but I want to be open as well about some of the real challenges and problems and think about how we might begin to address those. Essentially, what I'd like to convey is the value of the process as a basis for targeted empirical work, as an intellectually quite nourishing exercise in thinking about brain processes. And I want to convey the idea that I don't think that the framework will necessarily last into the future, because I think it's a model and it serves usefully to help construct and further our thoughts, but it will necessarily need at some point to be broken and refixed and formulated. So there's really, that leads on to a disclaimer, which I think predictive processing is wrong, which is probably not a terribly promising start to this, but in the sense that all models are wrong, as has been observed by Box. All models are wrong, but some are useful. And at the opposite end of the scale, I'm very influenced by Norbert Wiener, or Wiener maybe, one of the earliest cyberneticists who caricatured the idea of striving for a correct model by saying, well, the best model of a cat is a cat, preferably the same cat. Ultimately, if you're modeling, you are simplifying, you're reducing, you're distilling. And if you're seeking to be completely and comprehensively right, then ultimately you're not really modeling. You're finding the same cat. So this is a framework for thinking, really, and that's what it's about. So psychosis. Psychosis is not a diagnosis. It refers to a separation from reality. It's when somebody has an unshared reality, when they hear, see, touch, taste, believe things that other people don't believe or find to be bizarre and incomprehensible very often. It's largely split up into two sets of symptoms or signs. One of them is hallucination. So a hallucination is a perception in the absence of a stimulus, and a delusion is an erroneous or irrational belief that seems to be held without good evidence in its favour, and it seems to be held very tenaciously, even when there is good evidence, apparently, against that belief. It has many other qualities, delusion. It can be very hungry for evidence in its favour. It can shape all other ways of processing the world. It can become the absolute central mission of a person's life. It's a very, very interesting state of interacting with the world, particularly when one considers that hallucinations or delusions are unshared. They're not supported largely by one's social circle. So this is an example from a patient I saw, a young woman of 17 who I was asked to see out in Peterborough. And her parents were becoming very worried that she'd become increasingly isolated. She was behaving bizarrely. She was muttering things to them and about them. And this is what she described to me, which I think is a nice example of an auditory hallucination. So hearing her sister saying things about her, even when her sister wasn't in the house, just this constant whispering experience. Delusions are more about the way people experience and believe the world. So this is an example of a classic delusion of reference, the belief that somebody is being referred to by the popular media on the internet, that things are about them. Now, I was fortunate enough to spend some time working with a video game company locally, and the purpose of the collaboration was to generate a game that represented a character who was experiencing psychotic illness. And I find some of the assets that they created in the game very useful for giving a sense of what some of these experiences might be like. And this was a collaboration that was done with people who have lived experience of psychosis. So we would sit in rooms and spend a long time talking about the nature of the experience, the artists trying to, and the sound artists and creative directors trying to get it right in the context of the game. So I'm going to play you just a sample of the binaural recordings that they used with actors to try and give a sense of what auditory hallucinations might be like, particularly when they're critical and nasty and disturbing. I warn you, this is quite unpleasant and negative, so if you find it so, you do feel free to block your ears. I'm not sure how loud it's going to be, so I'll keep an eye on the volume. No, it's not loud at all, I'm afraid. We may have to do without it. I'm sorry. Well, if anyone wants it, I can send them the clip. I'll push on. My apologies. One thing about arriving 1 minute before the lecture is you don't get a chance to check your sound. Unless I put it in the wrong one. Just check. I'll just try it one more time. No. Okay, not to worry. So the basic problem that I have with trying to understand psychosis is that as this, well, I hope this plays, as this old video clip demonstrates, I think, very, very compellingly, the person with a psychotic illness is essentially inhabiting a world that is unshared, that is of their own mind's creation. It's populated with phantasms and voices and fears. And they inhabit and immerse themselves in that world to the exclusion of external reality. And that makes it very difficult to think of this in terms of a loss of function, because it's a very creative act to experience psychosis. And that, in turn, I think, makes it more complex and challenging to approach this from a standard neuropsychological or neuropsychiatric point of view. And when I was a full-time clinician, functional neuroimaging was just on the way in. It was just this sort of new, exciting technique that people were getting extremely excited about because we were interested in functional illnesses, and now we had an imaging technique that could tell us about function. And so there's an awful lot of excitement about what, at the time, PET or subsequently functional MRI would tell us. And since then, there's been an enormous industry of functional neuroimaging studies linking activity in various brain regions to various experiences, including those of psychosis. And I think what's become rapidly clear to most of us is that there is nothing at all magical in imaging, that there are all sorts of problems with interpreting the results of these studies. For a start, we don't know if somebody is showing, let's say, elevated activity in ventral striatum in association with, let's say, voices or delusions. We don't know whether that's a cause of the voices of the delusion. We don't know whether it's a consequence of those, and we don't know if it's just some compensatory activity associated with having this horrible experience when you're in the scanner. So there's an immediate ambiguity, and it's actually very difficult to get around that ambiguity. But in addition, there's an explanatory gap, which is, what does seeing this tell us about these? In what sense is this an explanation of these experiences? I mean, this is not a belief area or a voice area. These neurons are not hearing voices. We're talking about two different levels of expression or description. And to assume that merely showing a brain change associated with these constitutes a satisfactory mechanistic explanation is simply untenable, I think. And it lacks what William Whewell, the 18th century philosopher and mathematician and general omniscient, described as consilience, this ability to link together descriptions at different levels. And that's what I think our computational approaches should be striving for, and are giving us insights into. And that, I think, provides the background. It's the pursuit of this, or trying to bridge this, at least to some extent, that takes us in the direction of thinking about these mechanistic or these computational processes. So it begins with the question of what the brain actually does. What must it achieve in normally interacting with the world about which it must make some sense? Well, I've been heavily influenced, actually, by reading of the 1940s and 50s cyberneticists, including Ross Ashby. In fact, a number of the cyberneticists, there's a great book by Andrew Pickering, which I strongly recommend, called The Cybernetic Brain, in which he talks about the history of British cybernetics. And interestingly, a number of the early cyberneticists, including Ross Ashby here, and indeed R.D. Laing, who I was quite surprised to hear had been very interested in cybernetics, were psychiatrists. And cyberneticists, the term cybernetics, coined by Norbert Wiener, actually it comes from the Greek for steersman. And I think it captures this idea of one environment, one agent, trying to control, or one system, an agent, trying to control another system, which is its world. And this control essentially is in the same way that the steersman tries to respond to the tides and breezes and winds and currents in order to maintain a course towards the desired destination. It's not so much that they're trying to control that environment, but they're trying to control its impact upon themselves. And this was the essence of what the cyberneticists were trying to get at. And I think it's generated a number of insights that really are at the core of predictive processing. Ross Ashby came up both with the idea of the law of requisite variety, which is essentially that for one system to have control over another, it must be able to visit at least as many states as that system that it's trying to control. Or the steersman must have as many responses as the environment can throw at him or her. The good regulator theorem is essentially an extension of that. And the good regulator theorem, whoops, what did I do there? Nope. The good regulator theorem comes from this lovely paper written by Ashby in 1970, which I think has a refreshingly straightforward title compared to a lot of the papers that I write, which are always, hedging bets and saying vague things. This essentially says that for a system to control another system, to be a good regulator of that system, it must become a model of that system. And there's a very striking sentence in the abstract, which is this. The theorem has the interesting corollary that the living brain, so far as it is to be successful, must proceed in learning by the formation of a model of its environment. And I really like that idea. I find it incredibly simple, straightforward, and actually extraordinarily all-encompassing. Perhaps too much so. I mean, many of you might just see it as a truism, but it really struck me when I first read it. And I think it's essentially saying that our brain must, in some senses, functionally and structurally, recapitulate within itself the associations or the statistical regularities that are the things it can act upon in in its environment. So the problem is really this, that the brain is in an environment and it's not in contact with that environment. It's essentially encased within the dark cavern of the skull, and luckily the skull has some holes in it through which neural signals can percolate. And the neural signals, which are essentially a reflection of the world around it, come in very complex forms, or come in with great intensity and complexity, but actually are binary signals that in themselves have to recode what's out there so that this model of the world can be built. And of course this idea gets back to von Helmholtz, who referred to objects always being imagined as in the field of vision as would have to be there to create the same impression on the nervous mechanism. What von Helmholtz was saying is that there's an inferential process going on where there are a set of impulses or impressions on the nervous system, and the inference has to be about what could have caused them, imagining what could have caused these things, and thereby building the picture of the world. And this was something that Vernon Mountcastle also alluded to. In the 1970s, there was a very eloquent quote in which he talked about us being in the prison of our own brain and projecting from it millions of fragile sensory neurons arranged in groups uniquely adapted to sample energetic states. That's what they do. They sample the energetic states of the world: heat, light, force, chemical composition. But that's all we know of the world directly. And he said everything else is inference. And the nature of the inference, I think, was named quite nicely by Charles Peirce, the early 20th century philosopher, who referred to it as abductive inference, essentially on the basis of data, reasoning what would have been the cause of those data. And that's the challenge that the brain faces in building its model of the world. So essentially, all I've said so far is that biological organisms use sensory inputs to uncover the associative structure of the world and thereby form or become a model of the world, but they have this problem, which is they have very limited capacity compared to all the possible information that's out there. There are constraints on speed. They can't do it instantaneously, but we want an instantaneous picture of the world in many instances. And sensory input is inherently ambiguous. And so the problems that are faced, and I think that predictive processing frameworks are there to help us understand, are this notion of information load, speed, ambiguity. And a clue comes from, again, the 1950s and earlier. Claude Shannon, information theory, great information theorist, talked about the information in the signal not just being the uncertainty or the predictability of the signal, which is what we can measure, but also the expectations of the recipient. And I think there was a lot of work done then that sort of sowed the seeds of these ideas, and that included work in telecommunication theory. So the idea here is that you have a limited capacity system, in those days especially limited, that has to transmit a large quantity of data as quickly as possible and as faithfully as possible. And of course, one option that you could go for is transmit 1 pixel at a time the absolute intensity value. But that would be very, very sort of tortuous thing to do. But in addition, it would be missing out on a possibility of cutting some corners. And the corners you can cut are due to the fact that any given pixel is very, very strongly predicted by the pixels around it. So rather than transmit the absolute value for each one, it's more efficient simply to transmit when there is a deviance from expectation based upon what's around it. So an image such as this would capture an enormous amount of the information that you actually need in order to decode it at the other end. That was essentially the idea. Linear prediction can greatly speed transmission, and it can also allow for a small capacity system dealing with a large amount of information. That's working with the deviation from signal is a useful way of going about it. And of course that works from frame to frame, because if this woman is talking, then most of the image from frame to frame will be the same, but there'll be small areas that are changing. So again, you can use this idea of deviation from expectation. And it was Srinivasan and others in the 1980s who pointed out that actually this seems to be what's going on in the retina. So the retina has, well, three main layers, but there's the photoreceptors which receive the light, there's the bipolar cells which transmit to the ganglion cells, and the ganglion cells to the optic nerve and thence to the brain. And there are these interesting horizontal cells which allow the photoreceptors, or allow the cells transmitting the information forward to actually influence each other. So essentially, light activates the cells, each cell inhibits and is inhibited by its neighbors. So cells with similar activity will cancel each other out. And what will be propagated forward is the signal associated with cells that differ from each other. This they referred to as predictive coding, the idea of a newsworthy signal surviving and percolating forward. And again, pointed out that this is an efficient way of going about things. Now, the other problem, of course, is speed, because we can't transmit, as I say, instantaneously, but there are instances in which we really ought to. So this is Serena Williams, I think one of the finest sights in sport, although I wouldn't like to be facing one of her serves, because they travel at such a speed that from the ball leaving her racket to hitting you is about 400 milliseconds. Now, if you look at the speed of transmission from retina to visual cortex, I've stolen this, actually, I should say, from David Cox, who's done a sort of back-of-the-envelope calculation. If you look at the speed of transmission, there's about 60 milliseconds from retina to visual cortex. So suddenly you're 3 meters behind. The ball's 3 meters ahead of where you're sensing it to be. Now, if you take into account transmission then to higher visual areas, whether or not you need them, you're talking about 170 milliseconds in total. So the ball is actually potentially 9 meters behind. So it's hit you quite a while before you've actually seen it coming. And the idea is that tennis players can only do this in a predictive way, that to some extent our perceptual system has to be essentially sensing in the future. And there's some nice examples of this. This is the flash lag illusion. So if you see a spinning arm that's traveling at a constant velocity, then the idea is that actually you're not perceiving it where your senses are telling you, but you're pushing it forward. Essentially, you're perceiving where it will be on the basis of a strong expectation generated by the constant motion. And the way in which you can show that is to flash up an extension of that arm in an unpredictable way. So the extension is something that you can't predict. The central part that's spinning you can. And of course, if that's the case, then you should perceive the extension when it flashes up as being slightly lagged behind, because there's no predictability about it. And it's a subtle effect, but I hope you'll be able to see it, that there is this flash lag illusion, even though in reality they are fully aligned. The unpredictable bit you are seeing further back. And if you make it more predictable, as I've done here, by just simply flashing it up for longer and in a more regular or more frequent way, that lag is lost to some extent. So the other problems, we've had the idea of intensity, of speed as a problem, but the other problem, of course, is inherent ambiguity in sensory input. And this is put most simply by thinking that the image that impinges on your retina could be from something that's very small and very close, or very big and far away, or absolutely anything in between. And of course, people can have a lot of fun playing with this by shifting perspectives and so forth. So this requires further degree of prediction, and predictive coding was extended in a very classic landmark paper by Rao and Ballard in 1999 to take into account this idea that you can have prediction at multiple levels in a sort of hierarchy, well, in an actual hierarchy. So they describe a model of visual processing in which feedback connections from higher to lower visual cortical areas carry predictions of lower level neural activities. I don't want to go into this in much detail now because I'm going to unpack it a bit in a moment. But the basic idea is you can capitalize on what you know about the world to do this prediction in a less automatic, more context-dependent way. And so the idea of the model is you have this input, you have your prediction feeding back, which is somehow integrated with the signal, and the error signal is fed forward to change the prediction, and that happens at multiple levels in the system. As I say, I'll unpack that a bit in a moment. So I think prediction seems to be very important just for our very basic engagement with the world. And many predictions, I think, although we talk about top-down predictions, I think many of them seem to be just deeply embedded in our system, right there in the retina. You know, we don't have much choice over how the retina deals with incoming information. So I think broadly it might be a mistake, as we often do in predictive coding, to think about it always as coming from a high level. I think the predictions are there from a high level, and I'm going to talk about those in a minute, but I think we should be thinking about prediction that's actually just embedded in the way our structure is. So I think this sort of very automatic prediction is important because it means that we mirror the structure of the world in some ways. Just as Ashby said, we become a model of the regularities in our environment. So, for example, distributions of orientation seem to be recapitulated in increased representation of neurons tuned to particular orientations. So in our natural scene, there tends to be a preponderance of vertical and horizontal orientations, and that's just how our natural tuning functions seem to be in terms of low-level visual neurons. We also have these associative fields that seem to be well equipped to naturally processing the more prominent or more prolific or common contours that we see. And the positions of objects as well. Positional regularities do seem to be modeled in the receptive field properties of neural circuits. I don't want to go into detail, and this really isn't my field, but I think the evidence suggests that there's an awful lot going on, suggesting that the way we immediately encode and deal with and push forward information suggests that we are early on a model of our environment. But of course, not all regularities are regular. There are some things that just happen no matter where you are in space. They're context independent. But a lot of our success is our ability to use predictions that are context dependent. So the world has many second and higher order associations, and we need to be able to deal with those. So under these circumstances, the automatic embedded constraints, they're not necessarily problematic, but they will be unable to respond to different contexts. And that's where I think the higher level predictions may be important. So a good model, in essence, all I'm saying is a good model must incorporate the capability of treating the same input in different ways depending on the context. And the sorts of stimuli that we use to try and get at this idea are these two-tone images, which some of you may have seen before. These were largely developed by my colleague Christoph Teufel and Dan Davis. And this is, to people who haven't seen this before, it's just a noisy black and white blobby pattern. But to people who have seen it before, and particularly to me who's seen it countless times, it's a very, very clear image of a woman wearing a hat, smiling and kissing a horse. And that's because it comes from the template here that is of a woman smiling, kissing a horse. And if, having seen it, it becomes possible to disambiguate that using the new prior knowledge that you have to, using the new prior knowledge that you have to pick it out. Sometimes it's difficult at first, but I just wanted to get the idea across. And Christoph came up with a nice idea for looking at the impact of this high-level knowledge on low-level visual processing, with the idea that you can have a context-dependent prediction. Both he and I separately had become quite interested in this area of the image and areas like this. Because here, in the two-tone image, there is nothing. There's nothing objectively there. But in the actual image from which it was taken, there is the woman's jawline. Now, interestingly, when you've seen this image countless times, you start to fill in her jawline, rather as you do with a Knizia triangle. I find it difficult not to see her jawline there. And Christoph began to wonder, well, is there something different about the visual processing of that area, depending upon whether or not you've seen the template image? So he devised a nice little experiment in which he assessed for what we referred to as these implied contours. He assessed individual sensitivity to just a contour within a patch, which could be, by changing the intensity, it was possible to bring the contour up and down above the participant's conscious threshold for perceiving it. And did that with both contours that were aligned to the implied contour and contours that were orthogonal to it. And the idea behind the experiment was simply you measure their sensitivity to these two different types of contour before they've actually seen the template image, and then you measure it again after. And you see whether there's been a change in sensitivity, particularly to the contours that match up to the implied contour. Because if there is, that must be due to the higher order information, because nothing about the image itself has changed. And this is just a representation of the data for speed, but essentially measuring sensitivity, you see that before they've seen the template, their sensitivity for both the edges aligned to the implied contour and those that are orthogonal are pretty much the same, but there's a significant increase in sensitivity to those that are aligned to the implied contour after having had the higher level information. In short, higher level priors based upon experience can shift the sensitivity of low-level feature detectors. At least that's the conclusion from this. So the overarching idea is that predictions based on the spatial temporal correlations, as well as past experience and knowledge, can improve our efficiency, improve our sensitivity, and help us to deal with an intensive, delayed, ambiguous signal. Make us more optimal, but at a cost. And the cost can be something, I think, that helps us to understand the nature of psychosis. And that's what I want to get on to now. So what if predictions increase sensitivity to something that isn't there? What if they create something that's not objectively there? That is a formal definition of a hallucination, a percept in the absence of a stimulus. And I think we see that sort of thing a lot, but we call it illusions. The Koenigsegg triangle that I mentioned is this idea of a phantom triangle that is implied by the array of black images in the background. We call it in the background because the best explanation for this is that there's a white triangle superimposed. And it becomes difficult not to see the perimeters of that triangle, not to see the contours, which suggests that, to some extent, our prior expectations at some level are shaping what we allow ourselves, or what we can perceive. And actually, I attributed the perception is controlled hallucination quote to Ramesh Jain, but there's a brilliant book by Hippolyte Taine, de l'intelligence, excuse my French accent, Peggy, which I read in translation. My French wasn't quite up to it. But he actually says external perception is an internal dream which proves to be in harmony with external things. And instead of calling hallucinations a false external perception, we must call external perception a true hallucination. This prefigured the Ramesh Jain quote by quite some time. And actually there's another brilliant book which you can actually download as a PDF by Gurney, Myers and Podmore from 1886 called Phantasms of the Living, in which they take 600 cases of hallucinations in the 19th century and just explore them. Very discursive, it's a very long book, but there's some real gems in there. And they talk about it from the obverse or the converse perspective, saying illusions are merely the sprinkling of fragments of genuine hallucination on a background of perception. And I think this, people tend to, I was taught as a medical student and when I was doing my psychiatry training that you must be very careful, you must spend a lot of time separating out illusions from hallucinations. They're fundamentally different, and one is pathological and the other's not. I think actually the border between them is very, very blurred. So to give some examples, a couple of my favorite examples of essentially overwriting the sensory input in order to perceive what is more predictable rather than what is actually there. So one great example, I think, is, and one that's been treated very well in the context of predictive processing, is binocular rivalry. So I'm sure most people know what that is, but essentially you present a stimulus to one eye and a different stimulus to the other. In this case, a face and a house. And what you might predict is that the perception would be that the information from the two eyes come together and you get a sort of face-house mix with a face with a chimney on top and a window or something. But the reality is you either see one thing or the other, with these transitory phases in between as they shift from one to the other in quite an unpredictable way. And it's as though you can only see a face or a house. And the explanation for that in terms of predictive processing is that to have a face and a house occupying the same space is so out of keeping with one's predictions that it's simply not allowed to be the percept. And so you must see one thing or the other. But if you're seeing one thing, then you're getting this continuous sort of error signal saying, no, there's some housiness going on here. So you switch every so often, and then there's the faciness complains, and you switch back. Now, of course, this could be just an eye dominance thing, from one eye to the other, back to the other. But actually, if you present one side of a face and one side of a house to one eye, and one side of a house, or the other side of the house and the other side of the face to the other eye, the perception is still a house or a face. So at some level, you're being allowed to see something that is predictable rather than something that's actually there. And there are many examples of this high level, well, this may not necessarily be at a high level, but of these sorts of predictions acting in a top-down way. There is some work suggesting that if you create another level of expectation, you can fundamentally shift the direction of perception. So there was an interesting experiment. I've never seen it replicated, but I can't actually remember the authors, forgive me. But they presented people with images of either flowers or felt-tip pens. And they pervaded the air with the smell of either flowers or felt-tip pens. And you're more likely to see flowers if you could smell flowers, and felt-tip pens if you could smell felt-tip pens. Which, if it's true and if it's replicated, suggests that there's a higher level which creates an expectation, which then shapes the lower levels of expectation, creating the perception. And then there are all sorts of other ways of showing how expectation can alter perception. So this is Ivan Muzhukin, I believe. I've never been able to absolutely verify that this is him, but lots of images on the internet suggest that it is. So he was a 1920s Russian matinee idol who was filmed by the director Kulyeshov. And Kulyeshov took a clip of film and then he interspersed it with images of varying degrees of emotive power. So one of the images was of a dead child, one was of a woman, and one was of a delicious-looking meal. And the audiences saw Muzhukin pulling what was essentially a fairly neutral expression, interspersed with these different clips. And they raved about his ability to recapture either great grief or lust or intense hunger, depending on what they thought he was looking at, even though the clip was the same each time. Essentially, the emotion of his expression was interpreted in terms of an expectation rather than anything inherent in the expression itself. So the but here is really that strong expectations create perceptions, they may overwrite actual data, and the system readily deviates from what we might call objective reality. I don't think there's a problem with that, and I don't think it questions objective reality, as some people seem to think these models do. I think reality is real, but I think we have a very sort of recreated, reconstructed version of it. And that, I think, allows us to consider the system and how it might go wrong. And so this next bit is, so far it's been quite speculative. This next bit is super speculative and done in a very simplified way that I'm not sure how well it works, but I want to just throw it out. It doesn't deviate that far from what other people are saying, so at least if I'm wrong, I'm not deluded in the traditional sense, but I'm just as wrong. So the idea is that we have this system. This is really sort of a recapitulation of the Rao and Ballard picture, which is a system in balance, essentially, where we have inputs that are driving forward, and we have feedback, which is essentially expectations at multiple different levels within a hierarchy. And the idea is that the system is aiming to be in balance with an overall aim to minimize the error. A good model is one that has minimized its error. That's our signal for how good our model of our world is, because if we keep being wrong, it's probably a bad model. On the other hand, if we strive to always be right, it's probably not a very useful model. And the overall aim is to adjust our predictions to minimize the prediction error. And the idea is of the hierarchy, and this has never really been fully elucidated. I think it's a problematic area. But the basic idea is that predictions at the lower levels are specific, physical, concrete, whereas at the higher level they're more to do with abstract, general, social predictions. And let's just work with that for now. That may prove to be wrong. And for the psychiatrist, this becomes quite a useful way of thinking of things because, all right, we're not talking at this point yet of mechanistic insights, but it may be a prelude to mechanistic insights and therefore to bridging this explanatory gap. So although they're not yet mechanistics, we can think about this in a brain-based way. And it's a brain-based way that's not necessarily reductionist because it has to take into account the world that the system is engaging with. And I'll show you what I mean by that. And I also think ultimately it may inspire conceptualizations of mental illness in terms of different perturbations to the system. So imagine a simple perturbation which occluded or somehow interfered with or molested the input. What we would predict then is that you'd get an imbalance at a low level so that the higher level predictions would essentially be overweighted because the lower level ones are not getting any input. Sorry, this is a toy example, so there's an awful lot of simplicity here, but I think it works as a thought experiment. Now, there are examples of this happening. Sensory deprivation, in which we occlude sensory inputs, are associated very rapidly with a combination of visual and auditory hallucinations, and usually in the face of a system that's unperturbed at the higher level. So the person retains their insight. They're seeing things, but they know that they're not real. The prisoner's cinema, when a prisoner is placed in solitary confinement, is associated with lots of weird geometric flashing images and things. Again, the prisoner generally, if they're not in solitary too long, retains insight. Charles Bonnet syndrome is associated with early visual deterioration and quite elaborate hallucinations. Often those are believed at the start. The person sees these things as being real, but over the course of time they begin to realize that they're hallucinations and ultimately can live with them as recognizing them as fantasy. But if the perturbation is, let's say, at a higher level, let's imagine something happens in your life that profoundly influences your high-level social expectations. We can imagine it might be something like early childhood trauma or abuse or neglect, something that essentially creates within you an expectation that this is how the world works, that the world is a dangerous, uncaring, unfriendly, unpredictable place, and that people are generally out to do you some misery. What you would predict would happen there is strong expectations that would weight your interpretations of high-level actions. So, for example, you might see a face and assume that the person behind that face has something in mind for you, something not pleasant. At a lower level, this might then lead to your interpretations of their facial expression as being particularly malevolent or nefarious. The idea is that this sort of experience can actually percolate down into how we then process the world and would become like a psychosis in some ways. It would entail paranoia, but for a very different mechanistic reason. Another possibility, and here I continue to speculate, this is one idea that's been put forward about schizophrenia, is that early neurodevelopmental changes lead to alterations in the feed-forward network, such that you get if you like, a hyper-salience or a hyper-precision of feed-forward signals, such that there's always a sense that whatever explanation you have, it's not enough. Essentially, you're failing continually to experience the world as it actually is because you have this percolating signal forward telling you that your predictions are wrong because there's a prediction error. And that would lead to a profound hunger for new priors, essentially. A requirement to generate a whole series of explanations that could then account for these strange and bizarre experiences of the world being a prediction error. And I think that's what you often see in, well, you do often see that in early psychosis, is this if you like, a quest for meaning. There's a riddle or an enigma that must be solved, and the person is trying out all sorts of expectations that could make sense of it, out of all these strange, uncanny coincidences. And ultimately, they may come up with a world model that can just about do the trick, and they then hold on to that very tightly. But it may be a very bizarre and actually ultimately very detrimental world model about there being a series of persecutors who are trying to control their actions and things like that. So this is the sort of idea of how a predictive processing model that I've described can then be fed forward into a clinical setting and allow us a number of opportunities for thinking about this explanatory gap and then testing it. And so I just want to present some data before finally moving on to the real challenges. So we spent a lot of time in the early 2000s actually doing functional imaging to try and identify brain regions that were especially sensitive to a violation of an expectation. So we did all sorts of very tedious causal associative learning studies in the scanner in which we set up expectations and then violated them and looked at the brain response and identified brain systems as a sort of marker that we could then look at in people who had psychotic illness. And this is some work that Phil Corlett and Graham Murray led, in which we did this sort of study in controls and in people with psychosis, and we identified the region, expected region in right prefrontal cortex that was responsive to surprise or prediction error in our healthy controls, and that neural signal seemed to be attenuated or obliterated or blurred in people who had psychotic illness. And in fact, the degree to which it was blurred did, to a small extent, correlate, well, it correlated significantly with their tendency towards bizarre beliefs, but it was a very small group, so I'm not going to hang my hat on that. We can do the same with a drug challenge, so using ketamine, which we know blocks NMDA and can produce a mild form of psychotic-like experience that is, for me, feels like the very early stages of psychosis. I don't think it's by any means an exhaustive or comprehensive model of a particular mental illness, but it's a way of actually producing a perturbation in the system that is targeted at NMDA receptors. And again, we find this effect where under placebo, people showed this right frontal response to surprise, and the same people under the influence of a ketamine infusion showed an attenuation of that. So it's very similar to what you see in the clinical population. In behavioral studies, I think it's also possible to test this model in, so far for us, very, very simple ways. A couple of studies that we've produced, which are, I'm going to focus on the top one, led by Christoph, which is essentially taking people prone to or early in the stages of psychosis, so they were help-seeking, but they didn't have a formal diagnosis and hadn't been treated, and hypothesized that their proneness to psychosis or hallucination would be altered, would be associated with an alteration in the way that they used prior information to make sense of incoming sensory input. And actually, Christoph made the point early on. He said, well, you should really predict that they'll be better at this two-tone image task, because if hallucinations are associated with emphasized top-down processing, then actually that will be an advantage when you're trying to process these black and white images. So this is just what he did. Showed people, both people with early psychosis and healthy controls, the two-tone images before and after they'd seen the template, and just measured their ability to detect a figure in the images. So half of the images were completely nonsense, the other half contained figures, and so we were able to calculate the D prime before and after they had this prior information. We showed that there was no difference in the bias between the two groups, but there was a change in discrimination index that was quite interesting. So I'm calling that perception, but this is essentially a representation of their ability to discriminate before and after. So the controls and the hallucination-prone people before were pretty bad, as you'd expect, because they hadn't seen the clear image. Both of the groups improved afterwards, but there was a significant interaction suggesting that the level of improvement in our hallucination-prone people was significantly greater than the level of improvement in the controls. Now, you know, we're not working in a vacuum. There's an awful lot of work done in this area. I know Peggy's done some fantastic work on this, and there are a number of other studies suggesting that, broadly, that you can understand deficits in predictive coding as increased top-down processing in psychosis or schizophrenia, so enhanced predictive signaling. Phil Corlett did a nice Pavlovian conditioning hallucination study in which he created expectations of sounds in people who are hallucination-prone and not, and showed that the impact of expectation was greater in the hallucination-prone people. So a series of studies coming up with this broad model that having hallucinations at least, and possibly delusions, is associated with an enhanced use of prior expectation. But actually, at the same time, using the same model, we're seeing exactly the opposite. So Rick Adams wrote a great review, in the 2012, I think it was, I can't remember, showing or suggesting that actually you can understand a lot of the symptoms of schizophrenia in terms of an enhanced bottom-up processing or reduced, sorry, I'm fiddling around here, or reduced top-down. And a recent model of the psychotogenic effects of LSD by Carhart, Harris, and Friston have also suggested that it's all about a weakening of the top-down, completely the opposite. And indeed, there's a very nice review looking at relative invulnerability to illusions in schizophrenia, which is thought to be a consequence of weakening of top-down perceptual mechanisms. So let's face it, we have a problem. We have a problem. The same model explains hallucinations and psychosis more broadly, using precisely different mechanisms. And I think, we need to step back and examine that problem very sincerely, because if we sort of override it, as I think some of us, including myself, have been doing a bit, there's likely to be some loss of faith in it. So I just want to finish with a couple of slides that I think set the scene for where I think I should go next, at least. So predictive processing, let's acknowledge, is a normative framework. It's not a mechanistic framework. It's about what the optimal computations would be to manage in a world that is ambiguous on the basis of our predictions. But it doesn't actually say much about the nature of predictions. By and large, people talk about top-down predictions, priors being one level in the hierarchy coming down to the next. It also entertains different possibilities about the effects of predictions. So is it that when you predict something, it essentially suppresses the signal so that you don't have to feed it forward? You only feed forward the prediction error. That would be the sort of computational efficiency argument. But then others suggest that you can manage that by not suppressing, but sharpening the things that accord with your predictions, which actually is what the Teufel et al. Study of the implied contours seems to suggest. There's a sharpening of your ability. So that's a question that really needs to be addressed full on. I think the model aspires to, and often comes along with some baggage of mechanistic insights, but I don't think it actually in itself, at least in the way it's largely used, contains those. It brings them in by implication often. I think we need to be careful about that. I think it does definitely promise links to brain function. I think that that's the next step, and that's what will help us to get around this apparent paradox about top-down versus bottom-up as causes of hallucinations. And it can help us broadly to understand non-optimal modeling of the world, but as I say, couldn't necessarily distinguish between different forms. So I gave you the examples of a low-level sensory perturbation versus a high-level experience-based change in your model of the world. I don't think the model necessarily allows you to distinguish between those in a given case without actually bringing in some mechanistic insights to it. So it's a problem. In short, I think the challenge lies in extending the model to accommodate mechanistic insights. So to summarize, I've said all this. I mean, I think perceiving and comprehending the world is an active process. I think that's been thought about and said for a long time, much more eloquently than I have. I think that the healthy system confers this ready-made tendency to deviate from reality. And I think one of the things that's been a problem in psychiatry and more broadly in our assessment of psychotic mental illness, is this tendency to see it as inherently incomprehensible, as some massive derangement that really is going to require a complete shift in our understanding of it. It's a system that's just driven beyond the bounds of expectation and comprehension. And actually, I think in many instances it is perfectly comprehensible. It may be a small change leading to a trajectory of reinterpretation and reanalysis of the world that leads to someone to have this unshared reality. So I think the predictive processing framework offers us means of understanding where and how these factors may act, and with a further promise, but not yet, of deeper mechanistic insights. I guess you could say, so what? I think it's going to be very important to, when introducing the mechanisms, to then think about how this will inform interventions, whether those are at the personal level, the way in which you interact with people, the cognitive, behavioral level, pharmacological, all of those, I think, can speak to the predictive processing framework. And also, I think, thinking about it in this way does actually encourage and support a rich communication with our patients. I really do think it helps. Maybe that's just me, but I think it can give us a common ground. So on that note, I've gone on slightly longer than intended. My apologies. There are a whole host of people who've been involved in this, and I'll leave that up there. But thank you very much for listening to me.